In the final year of World War II, as Allied forces closed in on the Japanese homeland, one island stood between victory and the most devastating invasion the world had ever seen. Its name was Okinawa. What would unfold there from April to June 1945 would become the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, a storm of steel, fire, and sacrifice that would change the course of history forever. The waves intensify. The camera pulls back to reveal an enormous armada of ships stretching to the horizon. The date appears on screen, March 1945. By early 1945, the outcome of World War II was no longer in question. In Europe, Allied and Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin. Adolf Hitler's Thousand-Year Reich was crumbling. But in the Pacific, the war raged on with undiminished ferocity. The scene shifts to a war room in Washington, D.C. Maps of the Pacific Theater cover the walls. Red markers indicate American-controlled territory, steadily advancing westward across the vast ocean. The United States had spent 3.5 years clawing its way across the Pacific in a brutal island-hopping campaign. From Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, each victory came at tremendous cost. Now, Admiral Chester Nimitz and his commanders faced their most critical decision: how to bring Japan to its knees without sacrificing 1 million American lives in a direct invasion of the home islands. The camera focuses on a specific island in the Ryukyu chain, Okinawa. Okinawa, a 60-mile-long island just 350 miles south of mainland Japan. It wasn't particularly large. It wasn't particularly rich, but its location made it the most strategically vital piece of real estate in the Pacific. Whoever controlled Okinawa controlled the gateway to Japan itself. Maps show flight paths and naval routes emanating from Okinawa to the Japanese home islands. From Okinawa's airfields, American B-29 bombers could strike any target in Japan with ease. Its harbors could accommodate the entire Pacific Fleet. Its planes could stage hundreds of thousands of troops for the final invasion. Operation Downfall, scheduled for the fall of 1945. Okinawa wasn't just important. It was indispensable. The scene transitions to the Japanese perspective. Underground bunkers carved into Okinawa's limestone hills. Japanese soldiers digging, fortifying, preparing. The Japanese understood Okinawa's importance as well as the Americans did. Perhaps better. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded the 32nd Army, a force of over 100,000 men comprising regular Army troops, naval infantry, and conscripted Okinawan civilians pressed into service. Ushijima was a veteran commander, methodical and realistic. He knew he could not win, but he could make the Americans pay such a terrible price that they might think twice about invading Japan itself. Images of massive tunnel systems and fortified caves. Instead of defending the beaches where American naval bombardment would destroy his forces before they could fight, Ushijima withdrew his army into the island's interior. His engineers transformed Okinawa's southern highlands into a fortress unlike anything the Americans had encountered. 3 defensive lines, anchored on the ancient castle city of Shuri, bristled with artillery, machine guns, and mortars. Every hill became a strong point. Every cave concealed troops who could emerge to attack, then vanish back underground. Ushijima didn't plan to defeat the Americans. He planned to bleed them white. The American plan was codenamed Operation Iceberg. It would be the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, larger even than D-Day in Normandy. By March 1945, more than 1,600 ships were assembling in the waters around Okinawa. 350,000 naval personnel supported an invasion force of over 180,000 troops. Images of massive fleet preparations. Aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, transport ships loading soldiers and supplies. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. commanded the 10th Army, a massive force comprising 2 corps, 1 Army, 1 Marine. 8 divisions would storm ashore under the protective umbrella of Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. American planners hoped that overwhelming force, combined with devastating preliminary bombardment, would crush Japanese resistance quickly. They could not have been more wrong. The calendar flips to March 26, 1945. The operation began not with the main invasion, but with preliminary landings. On March 26th, soldiers of the 77th Infantry Division seized the Kerama Islands, 15 miles west of Okinawa. These small islands provided a protected anchorage for the fleet and eliminated the threat of Japanese suicide boats. American casualties were light, 27 killed, 81 wounded. But even these preliminary operations revealed the horror to come. On Tokashiki Island, Japanese soldiers forced 394 Okinawan civilians to commit mass suicide rather than be captured by the Americans. It was a grim harbinger of the tragedy that would engulf Okinawa's civilian population. 4 days, the Fifth Fleet pounded Okinawa with the heaviest naval bombardment ever conducted in the Pacific. Battleships fired salvos from their massive guns. Aircraft from Task Force 58's carriers flew thousands of sorties, dropping bombs and napalm. The scale of destruction was apocalyptic. American commanders believed nothing could survive such devastation. Explosions tear across the landscape. Fire and smoke consumed the hillsides. But deep underground, in their caves and tunnels, Ushijima's soldiers waited. The bombardment was terrifying, but largely ineffective against the subterranean fortifications. The Japanese had prepared for this moment. They would not waste their strength against an enemy they could not defeat in the open. Instead, they would draw the Americans inland, into terrain they had transformed into a killing ground. Dawn broke on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, the day the Americans called L-Day. As the sun rose over Okinawa's beaches, thousands of landing craft churned toward shore, loaded with nervous soldiers and Marines who expected to face the apocalypse. Aerial shots show waves of landing craft approaching the Higuchi beaches on Okinawa's western coast. The first wave hit the beaches at 8:30 in the morning. Soldiers braced for the withering fire they'd experienced at Iwo Jima. But the beaches were silent. No machine guns, no mortars, no artillery, just empty sand and abandoned fortifications. The Americans couldn't believe their luck. By nightfall, over 60,000 men had come ashore with remarkably light casualties. They'd advanced miles inland, captured 2 crucial airfields, and split the island in half. It seemed almost too easy. Soldiers advancing cautiously through villages and fields, weapons ready, but facing no opposition. The Marines wheeled north toward the Motobu Peninsula. Army divisions pushed south toward the capital city of Naha, and still, they met only scattered resistance. For 3 days, American forces advanced rapidly, securing objectives with minimal casualties. Commanders began to hope the battle might be won quickly. They were about to discover why Ushijima had let them land unopposed. On April 5th, American forces moving south encountered the first of Ushijima's defensive lines, Kakazu Ridge, an unremarkable hillside that marked the northern edge of the Shuri defense system. When American infantry attempted to assault the ridge, they walked into hell. Soldiers advancing uphill suddenly come under devastating fire. Machine guns, mortars, artillery. The ridge erupted with fire from positions American reconnaissance had failed to locate. Japanese soldiers emerged from spider holes and tunnels, firing and then vanishing before they could be targeted. Artillery observers concealed in the hills called down perfectly registered fire on attacking Americans. The assault collapsed under withering crossfire. The casual advance was over. The real battle for Okinawa had begun. For the next 11 weeks, American forces would fight for every yard of ground against an enemy who had transformed southern Okinawa into a fortress. Progress was measured in feet, not miles. Entire days passed with lines barely moving. The dense terrain, honeycomb of caves, and interlocking defensive positions created a nightmare for attacking forces. Flamethrowers and satchel charges became essential tools. Engineers used demolitions to seal cave entrances, only to watch Japanese soldiers emerge from alternate exits hours later. While soldiers and Marines battled inland, the Fifth Fleet offshore faced its own apocalypse. The Japanese had prepared a special hell for the American Navy, the ultimate expression of desperate sacrifice. The kamikaze. Scene shifts to Japanese airfields. Pilots in their 20s, some barely out of their teens, preparing aircraft for one-way missions. Kamikaze, divine wind. Named after the typhoon that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion centuries before. These are suicide attacks, young pilots deliberately crashing their aircraft into American ships. The tactic had been used before in the Philippines, but at Okinawa, it reached a scale and intensity that shocked even veteran sailors. On April 6th, the Japanese launched Operation Tengo, a massive coordinated assault by sea and air. The centerpiece was a suicide mission by the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built. With only enough fuel for a one-way voyage, Yamato and her escorts were to smash through the American fleet and beach themselves on Okinawa, using their massive guns to support the defenders until destroyed. Images of the mighty Yamato steaming toward Okinawa, accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. But American submarines spotted the task force. On April 7th, nearly 400 aircraft from Task Force 58 descended on Yamato like a swarm of hornets. American pilots were specifically instructed to attack only one side of the massive ship to prevent effective counterflooding. For 2 hours, they pressed home their attacks. Torpedoes and bombs struck Yamato again and again. At 2:23 in the afternoon, the great ship capsized and exploded. Over 3,700 Japanese sailors perished, including Admiral Ito. The Yamato never came within 100 miles of Okinawa. While Yamato died, the sky above the Fifth Fleet filled with kamikazes. Over 350 aircraft attacked in coordinated waves called kikusui, floating chrysanthemums. The suicide planes targeted every ship they could reach, but the destroyers on radar picket duty took the worst punishment. Ships under attack. Kamikazes diving through anti-aircraft fire, some exploding before impact, others striking home with devastating effect. On April 6th and 7th, the destroyers Bush and Colquhoun were sunk. The destroyer Emmons was so badly damaged she had to be scuttled. Throughout April, May, and into June, the kamikaze attacks continued relentlessly. Nearly 2,000 suicide sorties were launched against the fleet. Radar picket destroyers bore the brunt of the assault. They were stationed around Okinawa to provide early warning of incoming attacks, making them the first targets kamikazes encountered. The psychological toll was immense. Sailors watched teenage pilots deliberately crash into their ships, choosing death to take Americans with them. The destroyer USS Laffey survived hits from 4 bombs and 5 kamikazes on April 16th, earning the nickname the ship that would not die. The destroyer USS Cassin Young was hit by a kamikaze on April 12th, killing 22 men and wounding 45. By the end of the campaign, 36 Allied ships had been sunk and 368 damaged, mostly destroyers and smaller vessels. Nearly 5,000 American sailors died, more than perished at Pearl Harbor. It was the Navy's bloodiest battle of the war. Ashore, the battle devolved into a grinding war of attrition unlike anything Americans had experienced in the Pacific. The first major obstacle was Kakazu Ridge, part of the outer defenses protecting the Shuri Line. For days, American infantry assaulted the ridge, only to be thrown back by withering fire. The ground between American and Japanese positions became known as Death Valley. Marines and soldiers crawling through mud and shattered ground. Artillery barges. Machine gun fire. Men falling. The 96th Infantry Division took the lead in assaulting Kakazu. Companies were reduced to platoon strength. Platoons to squads. Casualties mounted into the thousands. Gains measured in yard were lost to Japanese counterattacks the same night. Exhaustion and combat fatigue took their toll alongside bullets and shrapnel. After 10 days of brutal fighting, Kakazu Ridge finally fell, only for American forces to face the next line of Japanese defenses immediately beyond. In mid-April, the rains came. Not showers, but torrential downpours that transformed the battlefield into a quagmire. Vehicles bogged down. Supplies couldn't reach forward positions. Wounded had to be carried miles through mud that sucked at men's boots. The rain didn't stop the fighting. It just made everything worse. Images of Marines slogging through knee-deep mud, carrying wounded on stretchers. Tanks stuck in the muck. Foxholes filled with water. The Japanese, fighting from prepared positions, suffered less from the weather. But for attacking Americans, the rain was another enemy. Men lived in flooded foxholes, constantly wet, never warm. Trench foot became epidemic. So did combat fatigue. More psychological casualties occurred at Okinawa than any other Pacific battle. The combination of constant danger, impossible conditions, and grinding attrition broke even veteran soldiers. In mid-May, the 6th Marine Division encountered a small hill southwest of Naha. The Marines' code named it Sugarloaf. It didn't look like much, just a modest rise, maybe 40 feet high. The Marines thought they'd taken a day. Instead, Sugarloaf became a nightmare that consumed 11 days and over 2,600 casualties. Marines assaulting the hill again and again, each time driven back by murderous fire. What the Marines didn't initially realize was that Sugarloaf was mutually supporting with two other hills, Horseshoe and Half Moon. Machine guns and artillery on each hill could fire on attackers assaulting the others. Japanese troops moved between the positions through tunnels. Companies that reached Sugarloaf summit were cut off and destroyed. The Marines attacked again and again, taking the hill only to be driven off by counterattacks. Bodies piled up on the slopes. Finally, after grinding, attritional warfare, and the commitment of massive artillery support, the Marines secured Sugarloaf on May 19th. But the cost had been devastating. East of Sugarloaf lay another charnel house, Wana Ridge and the draw below it. The 1st Marine Division spent 2 weeks fighting through this terrain. Wana Draw became known as Death Valley, a killing ground swept by fire from Japanese positions that Americans couldn't locate until they'd been hit. The Coral Ridge itself was a fortress with caves and bunkers immune to all but direct hits from the heaviest weapons. Everywhere along the Shuri line, the pattern repeated. Assault, casualties, minimal gain. Counterattack, more casualties, ground lost. Assault again. Artillery bombardments that would have obliterated conventional defenses barely scratched the Japanese, safe in their underground positions. Flamethrower teams became crucial, burning out cave after cave. But the defenders had prepared fallback positions, alternate routes, overlapping fields of fire. They made the Americans pay for every foot of ground. By late May, the cumulative weight of American firepower and manpower began to tell. The 77th Infantry Division, replacing exhausted units, pushed forward with fresh troops. The 96th Division, veterans of the earlier fighting, ground forward despite appalling casualties. And on May 22nd, reconnaissance elements entered the ruins of Shuri Castle, the ancient fortress that had anchored the Japanese defensive line. Marines raising the flag over Shuri Castle's ruins. A moment of triumph in a sea of devastation. But Ushijima had anticipated this moment. Rather than allow his army to be encircled and destroyed at Shuri, he conducted a masterful withdrawal south to prepared positions on the Kiamu Peninsula. Under cover of rain and darkness, thousands of Japanese troops slipped through American lines. The battle wasn't over. It was entering its final, bloodiest phase. American forces pursued the retreating Japanese south, but the terrain grew even more challenging. The southern end of Okinawa was a maze of ridges, ravines, and coral outcroppings. Ushijima's remaining forces, still numbering tens of thousands, fortified every defensible position. They had no hope of victory, but they fought with the same desperate ferocity that had characterized the entire campaign. The weather remained terrible. Rain continued to fall. Mud was everywhere. Supplies struggled to reach the front. And still the fighting continued, yard by bloody yard. The Marines and Army divisions, rotating exhausted units with slightly less exhausted ones, pushed forward. Casualties continued to mount. By early June, American casualties exceeded 40,000, including over 10,000 dead. On June 18th, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, commander of the 10th Army, was inspecting the front lines near Misato Ridge. He stood in an observation post watching his Marines advance when Japanese artillery, firing from hidden positions in the hills, found the range. A shell exploded nearby. Coral fragments, sharp as shrapnel, tore through the observation post. General Buckner was struck in the chest and died within minutes. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in action in the Pacific Theater. 3 days later, on June 21st, American forces reached the southern coast of Okinawa. The island had been conquered. Organized Japanese resistance was ending. The next day, June 22nd, in a cave on Hill 89, Lieutenant General Mitsu Ushijima and his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, performed ritual suicide, seppuku. Before dying, Ushijima ordered his senior staff officer, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, to survive and tell the story of the battle to future generations. Yahara would be the highest-ranking Japanese officer to survive the Battle of Okinawa. But the fighting wasn't quite finished. Mopping up operations continued through the end of June. Individual Japanese soldiers, hiding in caves, had to be rooted out one by one. Some resisted to the death. Others finally surrendered. The last kamikaze attack occurred on July 29th, when the destroyer USS Callahan was sunk. Even after organized resistance ended, isolated Japanese holdouts remained in Okinawa's caves, some emerging months or even years after the war ended. The scene shifts to a somber accounting. Numbers appear on screen as the speaks. The Battle of Okinawa lasted 82 days. The cost in human life was staggering. American casualties totaled approximately 49,000, including over 12,000 killed or missing. Another 33,000 suffered non-battle casualties, psychological trauma, disease, accidents. The Navy's losses exceeded Army and Marine casualties. Nearly 5,000 sailors killed, almost 5,000 wounded. Japanese losses were even more catastrophic. Over 100,000 soldiers, sailors, and conscripted Okinawan combatants died. Some sources put the figure as high as 117,000. Thousands more were captured, a rarity in the Pacific War, where Japanese troops typically fought to the death. But these military casualties pale beside the civilian tragedy. Okinawa was not an isolated island garrison. It was home to approximately 300,000 civilians. These people found themselves trapped in the middle of the most destructive battle in the Pacific. The results were horrific. As many as 150,000 Okinawan civilians died during the campaign, roughly half the island's population. Some were killed by American bombardment. Others were caught in crossfire. Many died when Japanese soldiers forced them to commit suicide rather than surrender. Still others were murdered by Japanese troops who viewed them as potential collaborators or simply obstacles. Images of Okinawan civilians, elderly, women, children, emerging from caves, emaciated and traumatized. The Japanese military had indoctrinated Okinawans with propaganda, portraying Americans as barbarians who would torture and murder prisoners. Entire families killed themselves with grenades or jumped from cliffs to avoid capture. When American troops offered food and medical care to civilians who surrendered, many were shocked to find they weren't going to be killed. The psychological warfare had worked all too well, turning civilians into victims of their own military's lies. Even after the battle ended, Okinawans continued to suffer. Their island had been devastated. Cities were rubble. Agricultural land was cratered and contaminated. Food was scarce. Disease was rampant. The Americans, to their credit, provided humanitarian aid and began reconstruction. But the scars, physical and psychological, would take generations to heal. Okinawa gave the United States exactly what it had sought a base from which to wage total war against Japan. Within weeks of the battle's end, American engineers were expanding Okinawa's airfields and harbors. B-29 bombers flew from Okinawan bases to strike Japanese cities. The island became a massive staging area for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan scheduled for November 1945. But the cost of Okinawa forced American planners to confront a terrible question. If an isolated island with 100,000 defenders had produced 50,000 American casualties, what would the invasion of Japan itself cost? The Japanese home islands were defended by over 2 million troops. Millions of civilians were being trained to resist with bamboo spears and suicide bombs. American casualty estimates for Operation Downfall ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million. The casualties at Okinawa weren't just tragic, they were prophetic. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, American scientists successfully tested the world's first atomic bomb. President Harry Truman, who had taken office after Franklin Roosevelt's death in April, faced an agonizing decision. He could order Operation Downfall, accepting casualties that might dwarf anything seen in Europe or the Pacific. Or he could use this new weapon to shock Japan into surrender. The Battle of Okinawa influenced that decision. The ferocity of Japanese resistance, the willingness of soldiers and civilians alike to die rather than surrender, the effectiveness of kamikaze attacks, all suggested that an invasion of Japan would be an apocalypse. On August 6th, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another fell on Nagasaki. On August 14th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Operation Downfall was canceled. The invasion would never happen. Whether the atomic bombs were necessary, whether they were moral, remains debated to this day. But there's no question that Okinawa shaped the decision. The battle demonstrated that Japan would fight to the last man, woman, and child. It suggested that an invasion would produce casualties on a scale that even the war-weary American public might not accept. In this sense, the 50,000 Americans who died or were wounded at Okinawa may have saved hundreds of thousands of others from dying in an invasion that never happened. Today, the cornerstone of peace stands at the Okinawa Prefectural Peace Memorial Museum. Inscribed on its black granite walls are the names of everyone: Japanese, American, Okinawan, Korean, British, Taiwanese, who died during the Battle of Okinawa and the broader Okinawa campaign. As of 2023, 242,046 names are inscribed. The monument is updated every year as researchers identify more victims. Images of the Peace Memorial. Families, American, Japanese, Okinawan, visiting together, paying respects. The Battle of Okinawa was nicknamed the Typhoon of Steel by Americans and the Rain of Steel by Japanese. Both names capture the ferocity of the fighting, the sheer volume of firepower expended, the industrial-scale destruction. But numbers and nicknames can't capture the individual courage, sacrifice, and suffering. American soldiers and Marines who fought at Okinawa displayed extraordinary valor. 24 servicemen received the Medal of Honor for actions during the campaign. Medics like Desmond Doss, a conscientious objector who refused to carry a weapon but saved 75 men at Hacksaw Ridge, embodied the best of humanity even in war's worst moments. Sailors aboard destroyers stood their posts as kamikazes dove toward them, manning their guns until the moment of impact. Japanese soldiers, following orders to fight to the death, displayed a different kind of courage, or perhaps fatalism. Many were young men who believed they were defending their homeland and families from barbarous invaders. The kamikaze pilots, some barely 20 years old, flew to their deaths believing they were saving Japan. History judges their cause harshly, but their individual courage cannot be denied. And the Okinawan civilians, caught between armies they hadn't chosen, suffered most of all. Families huddled in caves while shells exploded overhead. Children starved. Elderly were abandoned. The trauma of those 82 days would echo through generations of Okinawan families. The Battle of Okinawa raises questions that remain relevant today. What is the true cost of war? When does military necessity justify civilian suffering? How do societies recover from trauma on this scale? What responsibility do nations have to non-combatants caught in conflict? These aren't abstract questions. They were lived experiences for 300,000 Okinawans in 1945. Okinawa also raises questions about the atomic bombings that ended the war. Critics argue that Japan, was already defeated, that the bombs were unnecessary, that they represented a war crime. Defenders point to Okinawa as evidence of Japanese determination to fight to the death, suggesting invasion would have killed millions. The debate continues, but it cannot be separated from what happened on this island in the spring and summer of 1945. Today, Okinawa hosts major American military installations. Kadena Air Base is one of the largest Air Force bases in Asia. Marine Corps bases occupy significant portions of the island. This American military presence, continuous since 1945, remains controversial among Okinawans. Some see it as necessary for regional security. Others view it as a continuing occupation, the last lingering consequence of a battle fought 80 years ago. The relationship between Okinawa and mainland Japan is also complicated by the battle. Many Okinawans feel their island was sacrificed by Tokyo to delay the inevitable. The Japanese military's treatment of Okinawan civilians during the battle, forcing them into combat roles, ordering mass suicides, sometimes murdering them, left deep scars. Okinawa has a distinct culture and history from mainland Japan, and the events of 1945 reinforced that distinctiveness. The camera pulls back to show the Peace Memorial Park at sunset. Peaceful, quiet, beautiful, a stark contrast to the carnage of 1945. The Battle of Okinawa was many things. The last major battle of World War II, the deadliest campaign in the Pacific, a turning point in strategic thinking, a human tragedy on an immense scale. It was 82 days that shaped the end of the war and cast a long shadow over the decades that followed. On this island, three nations collided: America, Japan, and Okinawa itself. Hundreds of thousands died. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded in body or spirit. Cities were destroyed. Families were shattered. An entire way of life was obliterated. Yet from that destruction came something else, the beginning of peace. The veterans of Okinawa, American, Japanese, Okinawan, carried their memories for the rest of their lives. Many never spoke of what they experienced. The horror was too great, the trauma too deep. But in recent decades, survivors have shared their stories, ensuring that future generations understand what happened here. Museums preserve artifacts. Historians document details. And every year, fewer veterans remain to bear witness. The Battle of Okinawa reminds us that war is not glorious. It is not romantic. It is brutal, destructive, and traumatic for everyone involved. The young men who fought here, on all sides, were not born warriors. They were sons, brothers, friends thrust into circumstances no one should have to face. That they found courage in those circumstances speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. But they had to find that courage speaks to the tragedy of war. 80 years later, Okinawa has rebuilt. Cities have risen from rubble. Forests have regrown on blasted hillsides. Life has returned. But the memory of those 82 days in 1945 remains. In monuments, in museums, in the stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren, in the names inscribed on the cornerstone of peace. The sun sets completely. Stars emerge in the sky above Okinawa. Peaceful, silent. This was Okinawa, the Typhoon of Steel, the final fury before peace. This was the battle that ended an era and began another. This was the price of victory. This was the cost of war.